Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner, and welcome to The Robust Opposition. I'm going to introduce my next guest, and he is David Dayen. And I've known David for a number of years. Hi, David. How are you?
Hi, it's Dayen.
I'm sorry. I've known you for a number of years, and I've been pronouncing your name wrong the whole time. That's terrible. You are a fellow within these times who contributes also to The Intercept, The American Prospect, and more. You're the author of Chain of Title, How Three Ordinary Americans Uncovered Wall Street's Great Foreclosure Fraud, which was the winner of the Studs and Ida Turkel Prize. So thank you again for being on the show.
Well, thanks for having me on.
You're going to be talking about the Sears bankruptcy and why it was not inevitable, but in fact it was caused by what your friend Robert Kuttner, who wrote an article in the Huffington Post the other day, calls Vulture capitalism. And I really like that term. So you wrote an article 11 months ago about this and about how 19 retail chains closed last year. Do you want to, before we get into talking about Sears, do you want to talk about retail? Because you're saying that, you know, it doesn't really have to do with e-commerce like a lot of people think. These brick and mortar stores are popular. They're selling things people want to buy. You know, tell us what's been happening.
So the landscape of retail has certainly changed to a certain degree with the rise of Amazon in particular and e-commerce more generally. But all of these bankruptcies that happened in the last year, and you can add now Toys R Us and Sears, which both of which one was liquidated and the other ran into bankruptcy this year, to that list, all of these have the same characteristic, and that characteristic is they were purchased by a private equity fund or a large hedge fund that engaged in a private equity style play. And what that entails is essentially purchasing a company with debt, putting that debt on the portfolio company. So now where a retailer had a stable financial position, now they have all this debt that they have to service themselves, engaging in a series of financial engineering maneuvers to extract value out of that company. Essentially the productivity that is created by the profits of the company. And once that is over, the success or failure of the company is immaterial. All of the wealth has been extracted from that company, put into the hands of the investors who are with the private equity fund or the hedge fund. And what we've seen in the last year or two is that inevitably what happens is the portfolio company, the retailer, cannot service this debt. It falls, collapses essentially under its own weight, whether or not it is thriving. Toys R Us, for example, had sales that were, they were in the red. They were profitable, or they were in the black, I should say. They were profitable prior to having to file for bankruptcy and ultimately having to liquidate. So that is essentially the game. It's a, you know, some would call it a bust out. If you're familiar with your Sopranos, that's what this is. You come in, you loot the company of all of its value, and you leave it as a husk by the side of the road. And we've seen this play over and over and over again. Sears is only the latest.
Okay, well, why don't you talk a little bit about the scope of the problem? We talked about 19 companies. Maybe you can list some of the companies. How many workers are we talking about? How many stores are we talking about? What percentage of the economy is this?
We're talking about a massive amount of workers. Just at Sears alone, 175,000 workers have been laid off in the last decade. If you're talking about Toys R Us, that's probably another 50 to 75,000. Payless Shoe Source, Gymboree, the list goes on and on and on. And it's hundreds of thousands of workers. Consumer spending, as you know, is 2/3 of the economy. Retail plays a major role in that. Even today, with Amazon supposedly being the dominant force in retail, e-commerce is only about 10% of the total economy, the total retail economy, that is. So brick and mortar still represents about 90% of how people get their goods and services. And so this is still an important sector. It's a sector that has the ability to be profitable. There are plenty of malls in America, despite the loss of many of these department stores, these anchor stores, if you will. Many malls that are thriving all over the country, particularly in large population centers, affluent suburbs, and urban areas. But through this hedge fund play, which is not mismanagement, it's deliberate. It's a deliberate strategy to suck value out of a company. And whether or not it succeeds or fails on the other side is sort of besides the point. And what we're seeing is, particularly, a lot of these companies were purchased right before the financial crisis. And the loss of demand in the economy in the wake of the financial crisis is what essentially wiped out a lot of these retailers and caused them to struggle, because suddenly they didn't have that safety net. When the economy goes up and down and up and down, they still had to service this debt no matter what happened. And that was what got them into a lot of trouble and disabled them from being able to do the kinds of investments that would have been necessary to keep these companies thriving.
Now, I want to talk about Eddie Lampert and Sears, because he was a name that became known to me back in 2003 when he bought Kmart. Right. And I will tell you that at that point, my family's family business was still in business. Ultimately, it was not NAFTA. NAFTA started the problem, but then it was ultimately killed when China joined the WTO, and basically our family had to lay off thousands of manufacturing workers. We manufactured children's clothing in the South. But Kmart was a big customer of my father's, and they went bankrupt, and he was a creditor of Kmart. So I do remember that Eddie Lampert was able to pick up that company for a song. Yeah. And I had the suspicion at the time that he knew exactly what he was doing. He was buying it for the real estate, right. Because the real estate that all those Kmart stores sat on was extremely valuable. And at one point, that stock went back up to $150. Right. And then in doing research for this show, I understood that he merged with Sears in 2005. That's but right. He was very different than some of these other situations, because he had a lot of conflicts of interest. So before I get into all of the different conflicts of interest, can you tell the viewers a little bit about this man, his background, and what you know about him?
Well, Eddie Lampert was the college roommate at Yale of Stephen Mnuchin, who's our current Treasury Secretary. Out of college, practically, he spun off into this hedge fund called ESL Investments, which is his initials. He was seen as something of a wonderkind in the investment community. He was seen as someone who was successful initially. He had people like Michael Dell put a lot of money into his hedge fund to invest it. When he bought Kmart in 2003, he was able to turn that around for a brief period, and people thought that this guy was the man to lead us out of the retail apocalypse. He was seen as someone who was a turnaround artist, who was a specialist in this in the economy as it was in 2003, and he brought Sears into the fold and merged the two companies because he thought that they'd be stronger, together. They'd have a big footprint. They'd have branding all over the country. Sears, is first of all, Sears is the original e-commerce play, right? It was the catalog. Yeah. It was the initial place that you could go and purchase things without having to go to the store. Sears played a big role in the Jim Crow era, actually, because it was the one way that African Americans could get goods that white people could get by going into the store, and they could do it anonymously. Sears had this very trusted brand all over the country, not just Sears itself, but the various spin-offs of Sears products, their sort of branded products, Kenmore appliances, Die Hard batteries, Land's End, they eventually took over, which was a clothing company. So Sears was a very trusted brand. And by merging them, Lampert really thought that he could make a go of it. And you know, he sunk a lot of his own money into it. Actually, he became the chairman of the board. He took no salary as chairman, and eventually as CEO took no salary. He took a good deal of stock. He never sold any of the stock. He was heavily invested and continues to be heavily invested in the company. And so you could sort of make an argument that this guy was putting all his chips in on this one retail brand, and he was going to rise and fall with it. At some point, his tenor changed. He realized that he missed out on an online play, for example, which he did far too late. His management of the company was terrible. He installed this thing that some hedge funds do, where they had all these different departments with management teams fighting against one another, like the different departments within Sears. That ended up being a disaster. He did not.
I was reading that came from Ayn Rand.
Yeah, it's a very Randian strategy, right?
Yeah.
So there was that. There was the fact that the recession hits only a couple years after he makes this purchase and merger, and suddenly obviously he bought with a lot of debt. It's very weighed down. Much like I said before, the retailer could not, it didn't have any money to reinvest in the business, and in fact, he slashed reinvestment to some of the lowest levels of any company in retail. So he made a lot of bad decisions. And
yes, he didn't. I was reading that he didn't invest in the stores at all, the physical.
That's correct.
Physical. And I remember going into the Sears in Santa Monica and thinking how shabby it looked. It was not a place that you really wanted to spend a lot of time.
It was decrepit. And he also had this strategy with inventory where he didn't buy a whole lot of stuff for the holiday season. And sometimes they would get caught up in logistics and there would be masses of shelves that were empty and people thought the store was going out of business. And that's seriously not the way to go if you want to build a brand up. So, as I said, at some point this turned. He decided that the play is not to try to build a great company. The play is to take as much out of this company as he could when he could.
So the first thing that he did was the stock buybacks. Why don't you talk about how stock buybacks temporarily raise the value of the stock without necessarily improving the business?
Right. So stock buybacks are when the company has a certain number of shares of stock out in the market and they say, we're going to purchase 1 million shares or however many back, and we'll give you the investors we'll give the going rate for those shares, but we end up with less shares. And what this does is it's supply and demand. It increases demand for sales, and it ends up bidding up the price artificially because you have less supply of the shares of stock now, and by selling them, you inevitably bid up the price of the stock, but only temporarily. This is something you can do in some ways. And it's a way to leak out money to the investors, right?
So and also the CEOs. Can I mention? Because
of course, because the CEOs are some of the major investors in the stock. They are paid. CEO compensation is largely done around equity these days.
Yes, stock options. I was listening to a program about the tax cut, and the whole promise was they were going to give this money to these corporations, and they were going to invest in businesses and plants and hire people and make stuff. And of course, that didn't happen. They used the money for stock buybacks. And what happens
is the scale. Let's say what the scale is: hundreds of billions of dollars since the tax cut was passed have gone into stock buybacks rather than going into investment, rather than going into labor, rather than going into wages. It's all gone to these buybacks. And it's a way to reward the investors rather than the people who actually produced and made the company what it is.
And the CEO compensation, my understanding is they get stock options based on quarterly earnings. And I heard a wonderful program
Yes,
about
sometimes.
Goldman Sachs about this. They were saying when Goldman Sachs was privately held, it was a much better company because they actually were investing in businesses and giving them money to start, start things and make things. But once they became a public company, they got greedy because they began to see how they could enrich themselves. And this is aided and abetted by tax law, because apparently you're taxed at a higher rate for your income that you make, your salary, than
Yes.
you are for these stock options. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's absolutely true. In fact, there's a cap on compensation whereby the business can write off. So if you make more than $1 million, I don't know what the exact number is, but if you make more than $1 million as a CEO in salary, then that's the limit at which any dollar over that, they can't write it off as a business expense. However, if they give you your compensation in stock, that is unlimited. And so this was a way, by the way, Bill Clinton passed this in 1993. It was part of his tax plan. And the theory was, well, CEO compensation is out of control. And so if we put a limit on how much salary can be written off by the company, we're going to keep CEO compensation in line. And the company said, okay, we'll just give the money in stock instead. And it's created this perversity whereby the movement, not the success of the company, the movement of the stock price is the only thing the CEO and the top executives care about.
Right.
Because that's what drives ultimately their pay packages.
Okay, now let's get to the next thing that Eddie Lampert did. He loaded up the company with corporate debt. Why don't you talk about that and how he personally benefited from that?
Right. So initially he didn't. He personally benefited in the sense that he bought the company with debt and he didn't have to pay the interest on it. Sears did. So he transferred the debt onto the backs of the company. What he later ended up doing is converting that debt by becoming the lender for Sears. So ESL Investments started giving loans to Sears. Sears paid off their other debt and then only had debt with Eddie Lampert, who is the CEO and chairman of the company. He is the #1 creditor of Sears. So they're going into a bankruptcy process, right? And the top creditors are inevitably the ones who get paid out. So he's on both sides of that transaction. He's the chairman. He was the CEO. He stepped down when they filed for bankruptcy. Lampert stepped down as CEO, but he's still has a lot of stock, a lot of controlling interest in the company, and he's also the lender who is going to get paid out in the bankruptcy. And a lot of that debt is secured. In other words, there's collateral for the debt. It's mostly real estate-based collateral, and we can get into the other real estate play that he's done. But because that debt is secured, it's very likely that he will get paid something on the order of $1.5 to $2 billion in this bankruptcy.
Wow. Okay, let's get into the real estate, because I talked about that earlier with regard to the Kmart stores. How did he benefit from the real estate of the Sears stores?
Yes. So what Lampert did is something that's actually pretty common in these hedge fund plays and private equity plays, which is called a sale leaseback arrangement. So Sears is, the holding company, the stores themselves, and profit off the stores. And Sears also owned a number of properties. And so what he did is he split those two into two separate companies. There's Sears, the store, and then there's this company called Seritage. And Seritage purchased for $2.7 billion 245 Sears locations. The most attractive locations, the highest level real estate. You mentioned Santa Monica, that's right down by the promenade. That's very desirable real estate. He purchased these for $2.7 billion. ESL Investments, his hedge fund, is the #1 owner of Seritage. And now, I mentioned the sale, that's the sale part. Here's the leaseback part. Sears now has to pay rent to Seritage for continued use of the stores. And if they go out of business and he shuts down the store, there's a termination agreement that Sears has to pay to Seritage. So now this guy is the CEO, he's the chairman, he is the banker, as I just said, and now he's the landlord. He is the landlord for Sears. And he has benefited from this in two ways. Number one, he's gotten rent. Seritage has earned $394 billion or million, $394 million in rent from Sears over the last 3 years. This was done in 2015. In addition to that, just let me just one thing. In addition to that, the stores that have been shut down by Sears, Seritage now owns those properties and they are redeveloping them. And so this will be ongoing revenue, and this is very valuable property. You know, the Sears in Santa Monica, for example, is being converted into office space. This is happening all over the country, whether it's other vendors, other retailers, office space, residential. It's very valuable, and we're just starting to see the rent payments come in for that. By the way, Sears paid the property taxes to Seritage. They also paid utilities to Seritage. So there were a number of different revenue streams going on here.
Okay, before we talk about how this was allowed to happen and what laws we need to change to prevent it from happening ever again, talk about the one other thing that he did to benefit, which was selling off all the brands.
Sure. So I mentioned some of the brands before: Kenmore, Die Hard, Land's End. So Land's End gets sold in 2014, I believe, to a company that is majority owned by ESL, the hedge fund. So he's selling the investments to himself, right? So he's selling these brands. Right now, that Land's End brand is worth about $300 million or something like that, the share of it that is owned by ESL. So you have that. They put Die Hard up for sale. He wants to buy Kenmore. He's made an offer for $400 million to buy Kenmore, the other appliance. He's sold Sears Hometown, which is a different brand of store. There's about 70 or 80 across the country. He's sold that off. He sold Craftsman Tools to Black & Decker. And the consortium that still has an interest in Black & Decker is also ESL Investments, Eddie Lampert's hedge fund. So let's add one more thing. He's CEO, chairman. He's the banker. He's the landlord. He's also their #1 purchasing partner in these plays. So he has sucked off everything that's valuable about Sears. And the only thing left are these unprofitable stores that are all over the country and 68,000 workers who still work there who may not if this gets liquidated in bankruptcy. But Eddie Lampert's going to do fine because he has all these investments that used to be part of Sears that are now part of his empire, including the real estate, and he's going to get paid out in the bankruptcy.
All right. So one has to ask, how is all this legal and who could have stopped him? I mean, first thing that comes to mind would be the board of directors, but I guess they always stock these boards of directors with their friends. And then the other
chairman of the board, first of all. So, and yes, the rest of the board is a bunch of yes men for Eddie Lampert. Sears essentially is Eddie Lampert at this point, and so they're not going to stand in his way. And that's a corporate governance failure. Ultimately, one way that you could see this, having some sort of legislation to react to this is to say that a CEO and a chairman cannot be the same person.
Right. Now, the other thing that you mentioned in your article was the other creditors. The other creditors weren't going to stand for this. How much sway do they have at this point?
Well, the shareholders can sue. And in fact, when the Seritage deal was done, shareholders did sue. They eventually came to a $40 million settlement, which is really a drop in the bucket on a $2.7 billion sale of these properties, which they said were sold at a bargain basement rate to Seritage. So shareholders is one thing. The other thing is, yes, in bankruptcy, all of these deals that we just talked about are going to be scrutinized. They're going to be scrutinized by the bankruptcy court, which is a little more rigid than a trial court or federal court. And they're really going to take a deep dive into this. And we're going to see if these deals that Lampert made, which, he claims was, for the good of the company, we're going to see if they stand up to scrutiny. And so, it's an open question what is going to happen to Lambert's big dream of getting, all the value out of the company. We'll see.
Now, it seems to me that, this is not just happening in the retail space. It's also happening in the newspaper business. I mean, what comes to mind is Sam Zell buying the Tribune company, running it into the ground. then selling it off as distressed debt. And then Oaktree Capital Management, I did a protest outside Bruce Karsh's house about please don't sell the LA Times to the Koch brothers. Oaktree Capital Management buys this debt for, pennies on the dollar and then tries to turn it around and sell it for dimes on the dollar, whatever. And it seems like the financial industry just keeps making money from this shit where, by doing this shit, and the people get screwed. The consumers are screwed. The workers are screwed. Even sometimes the shareholders are screwed when the company goes bankrupt. Can you give some historic perspective to this? I started a book, and I start many books that I don't finish, but this book was by Kevin Phillips, and it was all about the financialization of our economy. That the financial sector has taken up a much bigger percentage of the economy than it ever used to do. And it's not really creating, as we've talked about a couple times, creating businesses. It's funny money, like casino capitalism, securitizing the mortgages and selling them off to sovereign wealth funds. And then John Paulson's hedge fund, where he tells Goldman Sachs, put all your shittiest mortgages, into this fund so I can short it. And then they sold those shitty mortgages to, pension funds, including state workers and teachers. And these hedge fund guys make billions and there's no consequences. How did this happen? And we know that obviously the repeal of Glass-Steagall had a lot to do with the financial collapse in 2008. But what about some of this other stuff that we're talking about? When did this all start, and how has our government enabled it?
Hedge funds were actually an accident of history. So out of the New Deal, there were these investment acts, the 1940 Act, which said, put much stronger restrictions on what you can do with other people's money, essentially. And family offices, which is what they were called, and they're still called today, basically people who invest on behalf of rich people, protested and wanted a carve out in the 1940 Act. And, the Congress said, okay. And initially it was just that. It was these, people who invested on behalf of one family. And, they were able to accumulate some capital and do that. It wasn't until I believe it was the 1980s or maybe even the 1990s. I think it was 1996, actually. And there was a law that opened this up and essentially allowed institutional investors to invest in these hedge funds. So we're talking about things like university endowments, public pension funds, companies like PIMCO, and other institutional investors. And it's I'm going to get it. I'm going to get the name. It's going to escape me, but the initials are the NSMIA, I believe, was the name of this this law that passed in '96 under Clinton, and it exploded the amount of assets under management at hedge funds. Now we also private equity is a little bit different. But we definitely had the origins of that in the 1980s with the corporate raiders and Michael Milken and Ivan Boesky and those characters in sort of the go-go Reagan decade when deregulation came in. None of these hedge funds or private equity funds were registered with the SEC until Dodd-Frank, and even that is pretty weak. None of these companies nobody really had a handle on them, and they had this ability to use borrowed money to engage in these practices. And in fact, they were incentivized by it because the tax code, at least at that time, preferred debt to equity. In other words, you could get tax write-offs if you bought something with someone else's money, with borrowed money, rather than if you bought it with cash, with your own money. And so all of these factors played a big, big role. And the one way I think to attack it is to go back to the 1940 Acts, the Investment Company Acts, and say, hedge funds, you do not get an exemption from that. Private equity funds, you do not get an exemption from that. You cannot use borrowed money for these kinds of plays. You cannot engage in the field stripping of a company using these tactics. You cannot benefit from using debt over equity. There are a number of things that we can actually do And the other thing is education and transparency, because you mentioned how public pension funds, union pension funds are invested pretty heavily in things like hedge funds. They don't get better returns. We've seen tons and tons of studies. Index funds over time tend to do just as well, if not better, than hedge funds. And there are people at these public pension funds that should be told, you are contributing to the apocalypse, not only in retail, but in plenty of different sectors of the economy, where this over-financialization and financial engineering is coming at the expense of labor. And you're a labor union, and you're facilitating this through your large investments in hedge funds. Yeah. What are you doing? And there needs to be a lot more activism around that, around yes. Organizations like CalPERS, organizations like the California Teachers Retirement Fund, and all over the country, to say you cannot participate in your own destruction, essentially, participate in the destruction of the working class. So there are legislative options. There's also sort of activism options here, I think.
Yes, and I think one of the options, and I know you've been reporting on this, is a public bank, a state bank, and also the city of Los Angeles. We're about to vote on November 6th for Measure B, right, which allows the city of Los Angeles to change its charter so that we could have a public bank. And that's a bank that invests in the community, in the infrastructure and social programs and housing, whatever public benefits we want to invest in, and not casino capitalism. Tell us how you became a journalist, because I was reading about your book, which I have to get and read because it sounds fascinating. Chain of Title: How Three Ordinary Americans Uncovered Wall Street's Great Foreclosure Fraud. Mm-hmm. And on your publisher's website, it says it began when you were a scruffy blogger.
Yeah.
But now you actually write for publications. So can you talk a little bit about your background?
Sure. So I was actually in television. I was an editor and producer of a number of television shows, Discovery Channel, History Channel, things like that. And I learned in 2001, 2002 about these things called blogs. I had never heard of them before. And I was interested in them, attracted to them, started reading them. And after a year or so of taking it in, decided that I was interested enough to start my own. And that was around 2004, maybe late 2003. And at that time, if you were someone who was blogging in a political sense, you were part of a pretty unique club. You were someone who was, there weren't a lot of people out there the way there is now. I mean, you go, everybody has an opinion, on Facebook or Twitter or whatever. There really were a small amount of people doing political blogging at that time. And so there was an opportunity, which I don't think exists today, to sort of move through the ranks, to be part of, a club that was engaged in this, that was small enough that you could make headway. And so I did that. I was involved in political blogging. I would, write my diaries at Daily Kos, in addition to my own site. But I, got to know people, commented on other blogs, and, got involved in that community of the blogosphere. And through that, sort of worked my way through the ranks, and got involved in a couple websites, like one out here called Calitics, which was for California issues. And also, I worked eventually in 2009, got hired by Firedog Lake, which is no longer with us. It's now called, I think, Shadowproof. But at the time, it was a pretty influential blog. And I was doing the news segment for it. And I did that for about 3-4 years. And what we saw is a sort of professionalization of blogs, and a number of people who got their start there moving on to established media outlets. And so it was such that I knew a lot of people. By the time I left Firedog Lake in 2012, at the end of 2012, I knew a lot of people who were you know, at these other websites, places like Salon and the New Republic, and places that I ended up getting started. Not just that because they were fellow bloggers of mine, but because I was engaging with their arguments, you know, when I was at Firedog Lake, and you know, sort of build up a reputation in some respect. So I was able to segue into journalism. By the way, all this time I was working in television still. In fact, right up until about 2015, 2016, I was still doing TV. So this whole time I was doing that, but I gradually managed to get a foothold. I was very fortunate in having people that took a chance on me and allowed me to do, whether it was columns or reporting, at a number of different places. I've been able to sort of string together a freelance career. And the one thing when I left Firedog Lake I knew I wanted to do was a longer and deeper bit of reporting on the foreclosure crisis, because I spent a lot of time at FDL working with people on the foreclosure crisis. There weren't, if blogs were a small group, anyone writing on foreclosures in 2009, 2010, I could count them on one hand, I think. I mean, it was like Gretchen Morgensen of the New York Times, Matt Taibbi, me, and a handful of scruffy bloggers, people, you know, who had their own websites, who I wrote about in my books. So I knew I wanted to elevate those stories. I think there were some of the most powerful people who were most powerfully affected by the financial crisis, and yet they were invisible in our public policy debates and in our culture. And I really thought that I wanted to elevate their stories and explain how instrumental they were to uncovering this great scam, which was the robo-signing scandal, some call it. I call it foreclosure fraud, which was the use of documents that were phony, that were fabricated, forged, in foreclosure cases all over the country on an industrial scale, millions and millions of cases. And it was really a handful of people that figured that out. And they were victims. They were foreclosure victims who saw it in their own cases. And then they decided to do something greater than themselves, bigger than their own cases. They decided to figure out if there was a pattern here, and they found each other in the comment sections of websites, and they decided to band together and expose this. And it's true citizen journalism of a kind we may never see again, just because of the nature of what it was, and how they built this real community and network to expose this one problem, this one scandal. And they did expose it. At the end of 2010, all of the major mortgage companies in America stopped foreclosing on people because they couldn't do it anymore legally. And so I wrote about that, and that's sort of the first 2/3 of the book. And it's very inspiring if you close it right then, because then in the last third, I have to tell you about how Wall Street and Washington got together and made sure there were no consequences for any of that whatsoever. So it's, you know, a sort of bittersweet story, the book, Chain of Title, but ultimately one I think it's about the power of individual voices, especially if they get together and work together, and what they can understand with no institutional knowledge, with no connections, with no even history of activism from these people. Yeah, they were able to really make a difference.
Now, it seems like you can choose your subjects right now. And what do? You're interested in something, and then you pitch it to one of these magazines, and they tell you if they want to buy it or not. And you're able to make
part of it. I at this point, right now, I have ongoing relationships with a few different places where I'm, you know, expected to do weekly or monthly stories. So a little less pressure on me. I mean, you don't have to just sort of pitch and pitch and pitch. You can, you know, you have an ongoing relationship. So that's good. And yes, as you said, it's a target-rich environment these days, between the administration, and obviously we have an election right now that we're in the heart of. And so there's a lot to do.
Well, I just want to close with one question about the future of journalism, because I asked Abby Martin about this when she was on my show a couple of weeks ago. You know, I'm sure you either read the book or you heard about the book by John Nichols and Robert McChesney, which talks about the history of how journalism was originally publicly funded in this country, and now it's all, like everything else in neoliberal America, it's all been privatized. Yet, do we really want this government funding journalism? So, in your ideal way, you know, Abby was thinking that individuals should pay. You know, that it's sort of like the public television model, that we should all pay for the, you know, the journalists that we want to support. And I don't quite like that. To me, that's like charity. I think there should be publicly funded journalism. I'm not sure how to keep it honest. We certainly don't want the Atlantic Council vetting the stories, what is fake news, or that other operation called Prop or Not. What is, in your dreams, how would you like to see journalism funded and supported and flourishing in this country?
Well, I think journalism is a public trust. There aren't that many occupations that are actually named in the Constitution, and journalism is one of them. Lobbyist, of course, is one of the others. Freedom to redress of grievances. So, but I think there are a number of different models that I think are being tested out right now out of necessity. The real problem is the corporate power that has, particularly from Google and Facebook, how they have corralled advertising online, which is the way most people get their news. And that is the core problem that is destroying journalistic outlets all over the country. I read something the other day where 1,300 metro areas now don't have a daily newspaper. Wow. Pittsburgh being the largest city that has no daily newspaper.
Wow.
It has online, but no actual print journalism. So how do you do it? I mean, there are a lot of different models. There's sort of the Patreon model, where, as you say, you get individual people to sign up and pay for journalism. I think that Google and Facebook should have to do their part. They destroyed it. They need to be in the conversation for helping to build it. I think if you break up these companies, you give more opportunities for other journalistic outlets to attract new advertising. I think targeted advertising should be banned. I don't think Google and Facebook should be able to track you around the web. And if you did ban that, then suddenly the cachet of having a unique audience would be important to advertisers. And that would enable the flourishing of journalism, particularly in niche areas. I think there's also models like what the foundation down that does the Tampa Bay Times. It's a sort of a nonprofit that has funded these things through philanthropy. I mean, what we're getting right now is the biggest journalistic outlets are funded by extremely rich people. People. Owns the Washington Post. Here we have this guy Sun Shang that runs the LA Times, and that's becoming a model. Like someone who has money to burn is spending on journalism. I think that's a very dangerous model. If you look at how
Randolph Hearst, remember,
exactly. With the yellow. It's not just William Randolph Hearst, but it's now this company that needs to be reported on in Amazon, and the owner of it owns the Washington Post, one of the largest megaphones in journalism. That's very dangerous. So, even if it's private funding rather than government funding, you run into these issues of conflict of interest. So I think, we're in a time where there's more journalism being produced maybe than ever. Or at least it's more accessible to people than ever, because you can sit at your laptop and you don't have to worry about, going to the newsstand, and you can get stuff from India, and you can get stuff from anywhere in the world, and you can get every local paper here in America. But it's also one of the worst times for journalists themselves, because you just see the numbers go down in terms of working journalists. So. How do we fix this problem? I think that would probably require another show to really think about. But it's something that's very concerning. I think it needs to be attacked from a variety of different angles.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Dave, for being on the show tonight. I really enjoyed your piece on Sears. I've enjoyed a lot of your work, not the stuff on SB 562, though.
Well, that also is another show, right?
Slamming those nurses. But yeah, so we'll look forward to reading your work in the future. And thanks for being on. Next, you will see me on Saturday afternoon. I will be in Los Angeles City Hall covering a very fun fundraiser for the public bank, which we were speaking about earlier. And Abby Martin's going to be there, and also James Adomian. I don't know if you guys know James Adomian, but he is a fantastic impersonator of Bernie Sanders. I encourage you, and I will put it in the comments, to watch his Funny or Die skit, where he tried to prove that Bernie Sanders was not boring. So I will be reporting to you live from City Hall on Saturday afternoon. Next Tuesday, I'm going to be doing a show with a couple of candidates. Sonia Airy, who is running for state assembly in a northern district in California against a Republican, and Sarah Smith, who's running against a Democrat in the state of Washington for U.S. Congress. So until you next see me, share this show, follow me on Twitter, Lauren_Steiner, subscribe to my YouTube channel, Lauren from LA, and keep fighting.